All right, boys and girls, real quick synopsis on how this thing operates and how we're going to use it for today's test. I'm just standing here for the purpose of narration. I'll be somewhere else when we actually discharge the firearm. But anyway, we have the descent basically bolted into our pendulum. We have a GoPro set up here at a uniform distance set to 240 frames per second. And the chamber is currently empty, but I'll add one round into the chamber, drop the bolt. Firearm is on fire. Again, I'll be somewhere else for this, but take our hydraulic trigger here and you'll see it run back until click. And you know, it'll obviously be more prolific when there's a round in the chamber. We're gonna start with unsuppressed. There was a lot of interest in that hydraulic trigger in the last video, so it was constructed using 2 syringes, 2 lengths of high pressure medical tubing, and a lure lock union. A metal bar was fixed to the syringe, and the syringe pushed between the arm and the trigger. If you want to know more about the experimental setup, stay tuned until the end. And I suppose the most logical place to start would be, well, Kurt, what cans are we testing in today's evaluation? And what criteria did you use to select those? Because I have a whole bunch of cans available from a bunch of different manufacturers, and some manufacturers are represented better than others in my safe. First and foremost, 1 can per manufacturer. That can also needs to be 30 caliber and bore. Even though we're testing using 300 blackout today, and a lot of 45 cans are capable of suppressing, to be fair across the board, it needs to be a 30 caliber bore can. And that can needs to be in its original stock configuration. So some of them are modular, and they need to be in the base configuration. So I'm not adding or subtracting modules to kind of cherry pick the data or anything like that in the stock original configuration. So the list is the AB Suppressors Raptor, the Energetic Arms VOXs, Bowers Group 30T, Bushmaster MUTA, the Rugged Suppressor Surge, the Stealth Projects Fusion, Elevated Silence Evolution, the Sandman K, and the Witt Machine Dirty 30. Since we have a lot of ground to cover in today's video, here's the data from the field. Core Essentials is a brand that I use on a daily basis. Their gun belts are in every single set of my pants, including my suits. Well, now they've expanded into iPro, bringing to market what they're calling their Neolock ballistic sunglasses. These things are polarized lenses encased in frames complete with side shields to protect against that high velocity frag or your range buddy's brass. The frames also include integral neodymium magnets that will hold them closed for storage and in conjunction with their handy visor strap. Lastly, they also produce a polymer travel case if you're like me and destroy everything that isn't encased in Type 2 explosive storage. Special thanks to Core Essentials for making today's video possible. And I think there's a couple different ways that we can analyze this data to draw some conclusions. I would say that you are likely not purchasing a suppressor solely based on its recoil reducing properties. There's probably some other factors that you are considering when making a purchase decision like that, especially one as expensive as a suppressor. So, to divide it rather crudely, if you do not care how much the firearm weighs after you add the thing to it, I think that you can just rank them solely based on this one went up the least. And if you do that, then you would rank them like this. Now, I find that to be fairly simplistic in its expression and not really representative of what's going on here. So remember that we have two competing processes. We have the fact that we added mass to the system, which is going to change characteristics. But then also we have what I call the air brake effect, which is the dampening of the recoil through the action of the suppressor, which is literally pulling the suppressor and the firearm forward that's attached to it, negating some of that recoil. So to be able to look at that, we're going to have to do some math. And I know that some people are going to get really angry about that, but please try to stick with me. I'm going to try to be concise. In order to do that, we're going to use the pendulum approximation. So a system of equations that describe pendulum motion. And in order to do that, we're going to work in units of energy, specifically mechanical energy. And mechanical energy, among other things, is defined as the summation of the potential energy and kinetic energy in a system. So at any point in the motion of that pendulum, there will be some quantity of kinetic energy and some quantity of potential energy. Sometimes that's harder to calculate than others at different points in the pendulum's motion, except for when it's at its full height. Because when it's at its full height, there will be no kinetic energy. All of the energy has been converted to potential energy, and potential energy is a relatively simple equation that's governed by gravity. So knowing the mass of the unit that we're testing, the length of the pendulum, and the angle, we can then do the math to figure out what the height was, and then from the height, figure out what the potential energy of the system is. So we have to stop and think critically about those numbers for a second and what they're telling us. Because if you ask the question, are those numbers representative of reality, you would be like, well, no. It's not like suddenly we add a suppressor to the end of the gun and the ammunition is producing a lower impulse on all the components, and that results in a lower mechanical energy because we added a mass to the firearm. Like, that didn't make any sense. So you ask, well, where did it go? And that is the action of the suppressor yanking the gun forward as it discharges, as it vents the space out to what would normally be the ambient air. It's now being sequestered by the can. So you could say, if you follow that logic forward, that the ammunition that we're using is capable of producing at least the amount of mechanical energy that was present in the unsuppressed firearm. And the only thing that we changed was whether it had a can on the end of it. So accounting for the mass, if we do some simple subtraction, then we end up with these numbers. So looking at these rankings, there's a fair amount of shift depending on what's important to you. If you're looking for maximum recoil reduction on something that is like a heavy caliber, then you may want to go with something tanky like the Surge. On the other hand, when we're speaking about intermediate cartridge applications, I would pay particular attention to these. And if you're really concerned about the performance per ounce that you're adding to your gun, then you might look at it this way. There's a couple things I wanted to add to this video that I just thought would make great preface material, but I didn't put them in the beginning of the video because I was afraid that it was going to screw up the pacing. So I'm going to do them now. There were several things that I saw in the comments of the last video that compelled me to make a live stream supplement on my B channel. It was a 2-hour basically question and answer session where I kind of went over all that. But the one that I wanted to touch on was, I know that the mass changes. It's in the math. Look at the expressions. You can see it yourself. And now that I've gone through what I did, you can see it again. But I guarantee you that I'm going to get it again. But here it is. If you look at the math and run it yourself, what we get out of the empirical testing is a result that is not congruent with just adding a mass to the end of the firearm. We get more reduction, and I'm not talking theoretical versus testing error and things like that. I'm not talking that. I'm talking much more than we would expect that if we just added a weight to the end of the gun. But since that isn't enough for people, and I haven't done it enough on this channel as far as testing, we're going to go out and test it again using this apparatus. And what we're going to do is we're going to shoot it unsuppressed again. And then we're going to shoot it with a can. And then I'm going to weigh that can, and I'm going to add a weight to the firearm that is of comparable mass to that can. And then we're going to shoot that one too. Elimination of variables is important to any experimental design. Doesn't matter what it is. So in order to eliminate variables in this one of the things that I did was turn the gas off on the firearm. And that generates a couple different effects. First and foremost, it ensures that I have to manually load the firearm each time. So there's only one round of ammunition anywhere in the firearm at any point in time. It also makes sure that all of the gas has only one way to go, which is out the suppressor. It can't be tapped off and go back into the action. The action itself can't move because it's not gassed. So there's no weights moving around inside of the thing. So we simplified the situation substantially by turning the gas off. I used a Fiocchi 150 grain loading for this test. I have seen some requests for subload testing, and I'm not entirely sure that that is relevant. I did 3 replicates per each test, and ideally you would want to do something like 100 replicates to get some real solid data, but that's a lot of data to capture, and that's a fairly expensive test for a YouTube video. Moving forward into the future, I plan to use this apparatus for recurring suppressor testing. So not only are we going to do the test that I mentioned previously, but whenever we do a new suppressor evaluation, we're going to include not only the audio test, the accuracy test, the night vision test, etc., but also a recoil reduction test. And I plan to express it. You guys can tell me if you have different opinions on this, but I plan to express it in that percent reduction value, because I think that that one's the easiest for people to understand. In closing today, I want to reiterate something that I touched on in my supplemental live stream from this week. And that is, as someone who doesn't produce these devices, who is simply a consumer / evaluator of what's valuable on the market, I think that the average consumer that is in the market for these devices is focusing far too heavily on DB data. Stop chasing DB data so hard. And I'm going to put it to you like this. If you're going to spend an hour researching a device for potential purchase, then you should spend about 4 seconds on the DB data. Because that is all cherry-picked bullshit that has been fed to you. And you should focus your analysis much more strongly on the other characteristics of the device that you're potentially going to spend about $1,000 on by the time it's all said and done.